perception of the Egyptians is of a cultured civilization, an educated people who worshiped their gods and rose to great heights of sophistication. Yet there is fascinating evidence which reveals they were also a warfaring people who developed advanced weapon-making techniques, including flexible metal body armor, deadly axes, and swords. Some of these weapons would be used for the very first time in history, and some of the battles they fought were on a truly massive scale. The greatest of all was perhaps the magnificent Battle of Kadesh. This battle was fought between the Egyptians, commanded by Ramses II, and the Hittites, led by King Muwatalli.
It's the first human conflict that we have any sort of detailed records for.
Even by today's standards, it was a huge battle with thousands of charioteers.
It's not inconceivable that we could be thinking of a total chariot presence in excess of 6,000.
Both the Hittites and the Egyptians would bring new, advanced weapons to the battlefield.
You could almost compare the situation between the Egyptians and the Hittite Empire to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century.
The Battle of Kadesh will also be forever remembered as the defining moment in the reign of the great Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II.
Imagine coming to the throne as a young man. New powers had grown up around Egypt who were encroaching on the boundaries of Egypt, and Ramses had to face this threat head-on.
Through his skill as a brave commander, Ramses protected the lands of ancient Egypt, allowing his people to flourish. The critical factor was ensuring the security of Egypt's borders. Egypt was a beautiful country. The great Nile River fed the surrounding lands, making them rich and fertile. For thousands of years, the Egyptians enjoyed the benefits of this bountiful location. Yet there was a major problem. Due to the country's exposed position in the east of the Mediterranean, the lands were susceptible to attack from enemy raiders crossing over from nearby territories.
If I could choose a place to live in antiquity, I think Egypt would be the place to live, and one of the main reasons is because Egypt had plenty of food. In the Bible you read stories of people traveling to Egypt because there's famine in their own country.
By around 1200 BC, the Egyptians had a powerful neighbor who posed a specific threat. The hostile civilization was the mighty Hittites. They were both forces to be reckoned with. The Hittite kingdom had, at its height, controlled large swaths of the country now known as Turkey, as far east as the Euphrates River and as far south to the Egyptian border to the lands we now know as Syria. The earliest record of their existence is from 1900 BC, and they were a powerful force for over 700 years. Yet their magnificent empire was almost lost to history. For thousands of years, little was known of their civilization, until a series of remarkable discoveries were made in Hattusha, Turkey in 1905. This amazing site is still producing a constant stream of evidence of weapons and ancient architecture. Archaeologists have now used the data to recreate these imposing city walls and give us a glimpse of the impressive size and power of the city.
The empire, the state, can document its power by building and sustaining these large monumental walls. Some features of these walls are maybe comparable to present-day representative buildings like, let's say, the White House in Washington or other state buildings all over the world, which are also built to represent and document the power of a given state.
We now realize how important the ancient city of Hattusha was, and how powerful a military powerhouse the Hittites had become.
They had to have a large, powerful, well-trained and well-organized army. It was one of the key factors in their policy.
They have discovered some rare and intriguing finds, which show the Hittites' level of craftsmanship in their weaponry. They include superb bronze arrow and spearheads, cutting knives, and an extremely well-preserved 3,000-year-old axe head. One particularly revealing find was a magnificent stone carving found on a wall 10 miles north of Hattusha, which shows the curved swords used by the Hittites in battle.
These gods are depicted all the same, holding a sickle sword. We think that the sickle sword is a significant weapon of the Hittite army.
The unusual weaponry was specific to the Hittites, who had developed lethal sickle-shaped weapons. These were unlike anything the Egyptians were using at the time.
The Egyptians had made the critical error of allowing their military system to become obsolete, and indeed their military equipment to become obsolete. That is an absolute recipe for disaster at any period in history.
In contrast, the Egyptian army of this period was an infantry force of bowmen, spearmen, and archers. For thousands of years, the Egyptians had not needed to significantly develop their weapons, as their enemies were no more advanced than themselves. But all this would change when they came into major conflict with the Hittites. The stockpile of Egyptian weapons would be severely tested, weapons such as the mace. In Oxford, England, is one of the earliest mace heads ever found. This stunning weapon is known as the mace head of King Scorpion. This 3,000-year-old beautifully carved mace head was used in ceremonies, yet other simpler versions were used to smash heads open on the battlefield.
The technology for putting the hole in the middle of the mace is really quite phenomenal. What they do is they heat the rock, they drop water on it, a few droplets at a time, just enough to cause a small crack. Then you can chip the crack away and you can repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and eventually there is a hole in the middle which can then be worked smooth. It can crack quite hard objects quite quickly and quite effectively, so a single hit could do an enormous amount of damage.
It was an awesome weapon, if used on an unprotected skull. By using 21st century technology, we can see just how much damage a heavy stone mace can inflict on the bones of a skull. Using a camera that shoots at 2,500 frames per second, we can see the incredible destruction wrought by this weapon. For thousands of years, it would be wielded by Egyptians in battle as one of the important weapons they used to suppress invading enemies. But when armies reached Egypt's borders who wore metal helmets, the mace became useless. Strong helmets constructed from a composite of metals would protect enemies against the mace. Having seen the effects of the mace on an animal's skull, we will see how much damage it can inflict on a metal helmet.
Let's have a look here. Oh, hit right on one of the rivets. And there we go. Perfect little match. It's not really penetrated though. Bit of a headache, but you might survive that.
By the 13th century BC, the Egyptian army had become weak against well-protected enemy forces. They found themselves dropping behind in a developing ancient arms race.
Egypt geographically was so well protected, with the deserts on all sides and the Mediterranean to the north. There really wasn't much need for them to develop any kind of more sophisticated types of military technology. However, later on, when they came under threat from the Kerma culture in the south in Africa and from Syria-Palestine in the northeast, at that stage, they simply had to develop more sophisticated types of military technology. They had to catch up with the other cultures who were their rivals in creating an empire in northeast Africa and in Syria-Palestine.
But there was one Egyptian ruler who would realize the importance of arming the country with cutting-edge military technology in order to survive and prosper.
For Ramesses II to remain a dominant player in the ancient world at the time, it was absolutely crucial that he stayed abreast of the times. His army needed to be on a par with the Hittite army.
New, powerful weapons which could cause great carnage had to be created. Weapons such as the penetrative axe. By 1200 BC, the Egyptians had become complacent and for thousands of years had not developed their battle techniques. Egyptian warriors were used to the simple weapons they had relied upon for centuries, such as the mace. Yet with increasing threats from the Hittites, they needed more lethal weaponry. The great Egyptian leader Ramses II instigated huge changes in military technology and strategy in order for the Egyptians to retain their power.
He became the archetypal pharaoh, and it's not a surprise that virtually all the pharaohs of the 20th dynasty called themselves Ramses.
Ramses was the son of Seti I and was born around 1302 BC. At the age of 14, he was appointed Prince Regent by his father. He is believed to have taken the throne in his early 20s and to have ruled between 1279 to 1213 BC. He would become the most prolific pharaoh to have lived, with many of his monuments still surviving today. These include the famous rock-cut temple at Abu Simbel, the stunning decorative hall in Karnak, and the mortuary temple, the Ram Museum at Thebes. Even after thousands of years, the splendor of these sites still confounds modern architects and engineers. Ramses II was an extremely ambitious ruler who wanted to seize new territories as well as protecting those he already held. He knew that his army had to be just as well armed as those of his aggressive neighbors.
One of the first things that Ramesses had to do was to face a new threat to Egypt, and this was the Hittite Empire. They were the new emerging power in the Middle East, and they were attacking the boundaries of Egypt and disrupting the trade into Egypt.
But how would the Egyptians tackle this difficult task? Under Ramses, they began by capturing, then adapting their enemies' weapons. In 1720 BC, Egypt was invaded by a warring people called the Hyksos. Egypt defeated the Hyksos and then took their more advanced weapons and copied them.
The princes from Thebes had driven out the Hyksos from Egypt, but they'd learnt by experience that they were able to adopt and adapt the weapons that had come into Egypt at this time. And from that point on, for a foreign foe approaching the Egyptian army, they knew they were facing the latest technology and the best weapons.
Amazingly, one of the most dangerous weapons developed by the Egyptians was the penetrative axe. In the Cairo Museum, there is a spectacular example of a 3,500-year-old ceremonial axe. The precision of the weapon maker was so fine that the axe is still sharp today. The combining of different metals to make stronger weapons became key. In Herefordshire, England, blacksmith Steve Blewett uses techniques which have not changed for thousands of years. Yet during the Egyptian period, new metal compounds were used in weaponry to make them stronger. Every small improvement would give the army an advantage.
When we're reproducing things like this, the technology is exactly the same. We use open fires and molds. We're still discovering things that we'd actually forgotten that they used over 2,000 years ago. This is a bronze Egyptian penetrative axe. As far as we can gather, it probably would have been used on fleeing and wounded opponents.
The new, stronger penetrative axe could cause serious damage against most protection.
This is bronze, which is a mixture of copper and tin, and bronze is actually 3 times harder than either of the parent metals. It's roughly between 9 and 10% tin, and the rest is copper.